Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 190, Jewish Camps, Jewish Utopias. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And after taking a brief break, which wasn't really a break or a digression at all last week for our wonderful episode with Tiffany Schlein on the idea of the Tech Shabbat, we are back to our series on Jewish education, which we've done at this time of year because it's the start of the school year, so it seemed like a good time to explore the topic of education. Today's episode, though, we're actually going to be looking at education that happens specifically not during the school year at Jewish camp. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to mention that it is the high holiday season. We hope everybody has had a good Rosh Hashanah and is looking forward to Yom Kippur coming up next week. And this is a time of year where often folks like to give a little financial support to the Jewish organizations that they're part of. We're trying not to overwhelm people with emails and solicitations, but we'll just mention it here on the podcast that if you are inclined to provide a small donation to support the work of Judaism Unbound, this would be a nice time of year to do it, and we would appreciate it very much. All you have to do is go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate, and there are all kinds of ways that you can donate, whether a recurring monthly gift or a one-time gift. We like to throw out the idea there of $1 per every episode that you listen to. So if you're a very regular listener, perhaps a gift of $50, $54 would be a nice gift at this time of year. And if you're a less regular listener, perhaps a gift of $18 or something like that. And if you're a wealthy regular listener who really loves what we're doing and wants to amplify our impact, then we would be really grateful for any larger amount that you might be able to give. So now let's jump into the topic of today's conversation, Jewish summer camp. Our guest today, Avi Orlow, is the Vice President for Innovation and Education at the Foundation for Jewish Camp. Before joining the Foundation for Jewish Camp, he was the campus rabbi and assistant director of the St. Louis Hillel at Washington University, and he has held numerous positions as a rabbi, educator, and youth leader. He himself spent 17 years as a camper and educator at Ramah camps in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, as well as camps in the former Soviet Union. Avi Orlow has rabbinical ordination from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, which is an open Orthodox rabbinical school in New York. We're excited to jump into this topic of summer camp as a place for Jewish learning and Jewish education. So Avi Orlow, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So we want to talk about summer camp, particularly overnight summer camp, as a place of Jewish education as part of this series on education. A lot of people talk about camp as an important place in a child's Jewish life, a place where somehow things happen to them that hopefully connect them more solidly to Judaism, to a Jewish community. People don't necessarily talk so much about summer camp as a place of Jewish education, but you do, and that's why we wanted to talk to you about the idea of whether camp has been a place of Jewish education, is a place of Jewish education, will become a better place of Jewish education, and how we ought to be thinking about that, and how camps should be thinking about that. So I thought we could start off by just asking you to reflect a little bit about how you think about camp as a place of Jewish education and what you've done over the last many years that you've been working at the Foundation for Jewish Camp to try to make it even more so.
Yeah, sure. I just would start off by giving a little history lesson for our listeners. Camping in North America started off over 100 years ago, and Jewish communities started off as fresh air funds to get kids out of the city, to take an immigrant population and make them American, and really teach them English and teach them how to be American and how to be productive members of the larger society. And to a great degree, we're wildly successful. And then later in the 40s and 50s, we realized that camp could be a youth-centered space for the articulation of unique brands of Jewish life. And what we're seeing now is that there are ways of expressing Jewish life in camp which don't necessarily come into full fruition outside of camp. So we're trying to help camps continue in their mission and help them go beyond that to expressing that beyond the bubble of camp. When I think about the bubble of camp, I always go back to the line in Exodus when Moses comes to talk to Pharaoh. He doesn't just come with the "let my people go," sort of a human escape from slavery. He very particularly says, "Let my people go to a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to celebrate our God." Before they can have liberation, they need a retreat. They need a place set away to actually think about things differently. And what we see every summer is, what does it mean to actually be in retreat from the rest of civilization? Enables people to imagine a utopia, imagine the way that the world could be, and then to actually think about how do they operationalize that to the way it will be. And what's fascinating is once you have an imagination, from there you can build a nation. So I think long before we got to let my people go is let my people go to camp and then have that imagination upon which we can build a nation.
Well, I remember reading an article some years ago by Seymour Fox, who's known in the Jewish world as Shlomo Fox, and it was a fascinating story about the founding of Camp Ramah, which is the conservative movement system of camps. And what was fascinating to me, in part because at the time I was the Hillel director at the University of Chicago, was that Seymour Fox had recruited some of the leading lights of the Chicago School of Education to work with him to create this camp. Some of the most famous names in education were involved in the founding of Camp Ramah, which I imagine was also influential on the founding of many other camps. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that history back then. I think we are talking about the 50s, the 60s, in terms of how people were thinking about camp as a place of Jewish education at a time that was really, as you were saying, the beginning of thinking about how camps could be a place to help people become more Jewish, and also a very important time in the history of education in America.
There's no doubt, especially in an overnight camping situation, that you're having a full breadth of human experiences. You know, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, you have a full experiences of what does it mean to be Jewish in this space. So instead of creating abstract notions of engagement, you're actually engaging with the big ideas of what it means to be human and the big ideas of what it means to be Jewish. Another component is how camps, and this is beyond any specific movement, can craft experiences with intention. So there's no doubt Ramah at its inception was trying to do that. And its inception was trying to say, how are we going to create an intentional Jewish experience here? There are many other camps, many other systems that are doing as intentional work. And what's interesting to me is how those speak to different projections of what it means to be Jewish, different realms of authenticity. Another one of the main components that camping offers is proximal role models. So when I go to other areas of Jewish education, the teacher is by a number of phases away from the learner. What is most fascinating about a camp experience is the role of that 18-year-old. The 18-year-old is not, a number of graduate degrees away from the student. Is only a couple of years ahead of them and is very much involved in their own educational experience and a role model for the camper, what that could look like. Every good camp director knows they're running two camps. The fundamental truth of camping is I spend entire staff orientation explaining to my staff that it's all about the campers. It's all about the campers' health, safety, personal growth, Jewish development, all those things, so that I get them to be not looking in at themselves and actually thinking about them expressing themselves as role models. Because in reality, we're running two camps. I'm running a camp for the campers and a camp for the counselors. Because the biggest change that will happen in a summer is what's going to happen to your counselors when they say, I am a role model for Jewish life.
So I love launching off with some of the history and with Ramah from Dan's question. And it's really poignant for me because I grew up going to a camp in northern Wisconsin that was not a Ramah camp, which was 15 minutes from a Ramah camp. And we never, and I can't overstate this enough, never interacted with one another. I name that because I think sometimes we talk about Jewish camp as like a big amorphous thing, and we sort of make it into a monolith. And I think that when we think about like what a Ramah camp is looking to do and what my camp was looking to do, they're both, there's a Venn diagram at play. There's a lot of things that they both want to do. My camp was a JCC camp. But there's also a lot of things that they're very different from each other around. And so I guess I'm curious to get a little bit of a lay of the land. So you're part of the Foundation for Jewish Camp. You're one of the leaders of it. Like when we talk about, quote unquote, Jewish camp, what are the different kinds of ideologies and mindsets and goals at play? And to what extent is a success story of like, what do the success stories look like? What is the goal of a Jewish camp in some of these different movements? And how can we poke at this idea that Jewish camp is sort of one big thing?
There's a certain tribe that you connect to in the camp setting that you're deeply impassioned by. The question is, how do we build onto that brand to think about what does year-long and lifelong look like? To do that effectively, camps need to actually be hyper-intentional about what it means to connect to their camp. What does a graduate of a camp look like? Even the movement camps that are incredibly focused on, like, they know what the outcome looks like, they also have to contend with the fact that there's a decline of membership to the legacy organizations. So you have URJ for the reform movements, you have Ramah for the conservative movement, you have various camps in the Orthodox movement, you have Havaya, we have now 2 Havaya camps with the Reconstructionist movement. They have to consider the fact that they might on paper look like synagogue movements, but by and large, who is getting connected to synagogue life in the 20s and 30s? So even the camps that are inheritors of wonderful ideas around what their graduates look like, they themselves need to reimagine what does lifelong engagement look like when there's another 10 to 15 years between the last time you will be at camp and the next time you even think about, I might have kids, or even find a life partner to have kids with to send back to camp, meaning that cycle is expanded dramatically. But as we know from your podcast, innovation is present in the field, but it's not distributed equally. So a shining light in this space, in my mind, is Camp Tawanga in the Bay Area. They very much identify that their camp is one of the main stops, if not the only stop, for many of their campers. And they've boldly stepped into other environments, thinking about what does Camp 365 look like. To that end, they started a bar mitzvah program. And local rabbis said, wait, you're crossing lanes. This is my lane. And they very clearly said back, a third of our campers, this is it. If they're a camper that's connected to a synagogue, we want them to go back to do the bar mitzvah at the synagogue. But to the third of our campers for whom this is it, they're not going to have a bar mitzvah? That's crazy. Another example is for the last few years, they've been running Yom Kippur services in a park in downtown San Francisco. They have over 1,000 people show up for a prayer experience that matches spot on with the brand of their camp, that no one who went to any other synagogue would even be able to identify as like, that is, it is the same, but it is spot on, matches who they are, what they want to see as results. And they're bringing that down the mountain into the city to say, we want to connect with you. The diversity of camps really range widely in terms of what Judaism looks like or has looked like or could look like. You have camps which are clearly Zionist camps. You have camps that are socialist camps. You have camps that are connected to the kibbutz movement. You have camps that are connected to religious movements. And each of those ideologies put together a different composite of what a graduate would look like. What's interesting to me is while some of the camps can be really very precise and very intentional about this is what a graduate looks like, other ones are not necessarily as forthcoming with their language, meaning they don't have an ideology behind them propelling them. So they don't have a rabbinical school behind them telling them what all this ought to look like. But it doesn't mean they're not intentional. And one of the things I like to look at most when if I talk to a camp director and they say, well, what do you mean? What are the outcomes you're looking for? I say them a very, very simple question. Who are the alumni that you welcome up for Shabbat and you parade in front of your campers and staff? Because whether you realize it or not, that is what you've created. Camp is an educational platform that you have these proximal role models that are just 1, 2, 3 steps ahead of you in the arc of experience. And you bring these people back because you're telling them, hey, this is what you could do next. You could join an Avodah house. You could be the president of your shul. You could be in a fraternity, meaning there's so many different ways that we message without having to be frontal about it to tell a 9-year-old kid who gets off the bus, what does the long plan look like? Camps are really good about actually saying, what is the model citizen within this utopia? And defining that. While it's very tragic, it is also really redeeming when you realize the tragic moment when a camp has to kick out a camper or a counselor. Because that is a wildly interesting educational moment that they're defining what is this community about? What are our values? What is in and what is out? And that is profoundly interesting moment when they're defining their utopia and they're defining their vision for the future.
As we think about Jewish education and ways in which Jewish education could be accomplished more successfully, in this series, right, we're talking to people who are running day schools. We're talking to people who are running new kinds of after-school programs. We're talking to people who are doing Jewish education on the internet. We're talking to people who are doing blended learning, which is partly online and partly in person. I'm wondering if you could position camp in that world, both as it has been and as it might be. What are the things that Jewish education at camp might do better than Jewish education anywhere else? And what are the ways in which Jewish education at camp might be changed and improved to take more full advantage of what camp is really, really good at?
To start off, I think that there is a youthfulness and a playfulness of the space of camp that begs the question from Spinal Tap of, what does it mean this one goes to 11? You know, what does it mean that you're creating a playfulness that people could say, let's take this to the logical extreme. Let's go there. Let's push that envelope. And I think that is sort of the intensity of the space that enables people to go further with any given ideology, any given thought or of notion of utopia. Let's actually go there. Like, there's an iterative process of what camp offers us of let's do it this summer, let's evaluate it, and let's try it again next summer. And there's a sort of a incremental notion of what you could do in a camp environment because it is so finite and repeated. Another notion, to quote Dan Liebitson, years ago when we sat and talked, we had a whole conversation when we both worked at Hillel about what is the escape velocity. You know, so we have the students who are on campus for 4 years, but we have to figure out how to get them over this chasm of emptiness. What's the escape velocity from this space?
Meaning that period when they're just sort of floating around as individuals and until some time when they might settle more firmly into some kind of community or the rest of their lives.
Camp is very much a bubble. It's very much youth-focused, very much youth-led. So many people feel totally self-actualized. So what is the escape velocity from that bubble? You know, to get out there, to sort of achieve your own orbit of that identity. And I think this is an ongoing challenge. I think the next chapter for us, besides the escape velocity to help camps go beyond the bubble of camp, is also help them give birth to the ideology which is nascent and actually at their camp. Yes, I love camp because I love camp. I love camp because it's an extraordinary platform. And I think camp could do extraordinary things. But if we could do those things without camp, maybe we should do them without camp too. One of the things that I've noticed years ago is that every Orthodox camp, whether it's for-profit or non-for-profit, has a kollel, which is a group of young adults who have devoted time at camp to study Talmud, the history of learning Talmud, have their own chance to come up with their own novel interpretations of that, notably have a limited responsibility, if any, in terms of childcare or looking after the kids, but always have some touch point in some way that they're sharing the gifts of their labor with their community. Now, what's compelling to me is not the study of Talmud. While it might be personally driving to me as a human being, what I look for in terms of camp being a platform is that it could be a place that could very easily house those 20-year-olds, those 25-year-olds who are young, who are exemplars of the culture of their camp, who get devoted time not to be running after their kids, to go deep into the ideology, intellectual property, the space, the intellectual space of what their camp is and actually develop what is that escape velocity? What does this look like beyond camp, right? So what does it mean for a camp to say, we're really into social justice and we're developing deep thinking around social justice. And we have people on our institute, think tank, Orlow, who are delving deep into what that looks like. It would take so little. If there are any funders out there who want to invest in that, there's such a minor investment for such a major outcome of fully utilizing the platform of camp to be the full laboratory for the diversity of expression of Jewish life. And I always think about, there's a singer-songwriter, David Bromberg. He's a gifted violinist, and he was asked, why did you become a violinist? And he says, I learned to play fiddle because the guy with the fiddle got to sit closer to the fire. And I think it's interesting when you think about what is the centerpiece of a culture, right? And how do we give honor and respect to the people who are exemplars of it? We find a way to pay for it. What does it mean for another element of Jewish life to say, we want to be identified by our fire, we want to invest in people who get to sit closer to that fire? And in many ways, and the vision of this is camps turning the corner from just being a beneficiary from their local or ideological community to a cultural benefactor to those communities. What camps are extraordinary about doing is that human resource pipeline. And if we can create that arc of expectation and expand that further, what would be the impact on Jewish life?
Yeah, I think we should really answer that moving forward in this, or like start to answer that, because I'm curious where you would go with it. But I want to look in particular at some pieces that I think you've hinted at. This idea of intentionality. So you and I had some great conversations about that kollel idea and about what it would look like if camps that weren't Orthodox tried to take on, a similar mindset where it wouldn't be Talmud learning, but it would be, distilling something that is important Jewishly to the camp and then really valuing and putting, close to the fire, to use your terminology, but like honoring those who do it and allowing them to share with the camp. I think there's something powerful there. But what I realized in those conversations with you is I think many camps, they have a deep, it's not quite a theology but they have like a culture of Judaism. But I really think that in terms of intentionality, they're not always aware of what it is. And you could sort of put in a list, all of the Jewish pieces of a day, of a week, of a session of camp, of a summer. But if you asked even some of the Jewish educators at some of these camps, like, what is the distinctive vision of Camp X or Camp Y? Like, I think sometimes that's a challenge for the ones especially that don't have an overarching reform movement or conservative movement, or those to sort of fall back on some principles that are more clear cut. So I'm curious to ask, like, in the camp context, what does it mean to actually do to discern what even the intentionality is for camps to look inward and be like, these really are our Jewish values. This is, we might have whatever signage and stuff that we've got all over camp for all these years, and we might just walk past it on the way to the Chadar Ochel, the dining hall. But like, what does that collectively, cumulatively do? What are our values? How does sort of measuring that, discerning it, allow for sort of better embodiment of it by staff and others? And then the bigger question is, like, not just camp, like, what can this teach us about intentionality in education? Like, I think a lot of us are operating in contexts where we don't know what exactly our goals are, but, we're teaching a class once a week. How can we do better?
Camps are really extraordinary about creating experiences. It's not necessarily their job to curate the ideology. I think we're asking too much of them, or we're not giving them the resources they need to actually go there. And I think that's incumbent upon us to, if we want them to carry a larger load, to support that and actually help them in that space. So I think it's a distinction between sort of creating experiences versus creating ideologies. I think we need the ideologies to make sure those experiences exist outside of that space. But I'm not sure camps as it's currently configured are positioned to do that yet. The joke in camping is the first year you do something that's changed, it's heretical. The second year, it's not so bad. The third year, we've always done it that way. It's the nature of camp as this youth-centered environment that treasures innovation just shy of tradition, so like it needs that sense of you matter here. I always think about the juxtaposition between the moment we walk into a synagogue and the moment we walk into a camp. The moment we walk into a synagogue, you see the yahrzeit boards, the memorial plaques, and they're lit or not lit depending on when someone had passed away. You walk in and there's a clear messaging. You matter here. This person lived, died, and participated and belonged in this community, and they will be remembered here. And I compare that to when I walk into a bunk, I see a plaque with all the goofy nicknames and all the inside jokes, and it's similarly saying, you matter here. You will be remembered because we're a place of tradition. But it's not because you lived your life and died. It's because you spent a summer. And this camp is so much about children that the fact it's holy that you spent 4 weeks in this space. And now this is hallowed ground that you belong to and it belongs to you. So I think it's a different communication, but it's the same communication. You belong here. You matter here. This is your space. For a camp to go from we're creating these experiences to we have ideology and the capacity to help you do that beyond that space, it needs additional resources and support.
I love this so much because it's that selfish piece where it gels with my own life experience as a person who started going to camp at age 8 and aged till age 20, and at which point I stopped going. And I have thought about that as, I mean, you talked about it's not that you die, but in a sense, I actually think that what camp does powerfully and so usefully in the practical sense for people is it does condense like a lifespan into a much shorter time. And not everybody starts when they're 8, and not everybody becomes a counselor when they're 18 or 20 or whatever. But there is, I think, people accelerate their way through various stages of camp life really quickly in a way that I think benefits people in understanding their role in broader life. And so what I mean by that is, when you're an 11-year-old at camp, if the youngest campers are 8, you are learning for the first time what it is to be a mentor. For people who have gone to a summer camp, like the whole thing where the third graders have their friend 3 years older that they follow around constantly, like so many of us can think back both to that person we had who we looked up to and thought was divine, who was 3 years older than us, and also can look back on what it was like for us to be the one whose shirt was getting tugged on by the kid a few years younger than us who saw us that way. And I think so like 3 years in a camp context is almost like 10 or 15 or 20 years in a life context. And a lifespan at camp is, 10, 12 years. And so that's why when you do something 3 years in a row, it's misinai, to use a Jewish term. It goes back all the way to the beginning in a sense, because it's like in the real world, when something happens for 20, 25 years, it feels like it's been that way forever. And we forget that it ever happened another way. So I guess I'd love to hear just like, that feels like something that the world could learn from camp. Like we need people who at age 14, at age 20 can empathize with the role of a mentor, of a teacher. We need people who will take that and then look at their elders who are 60 or 70 or 80 and want to keep things the same way and actually think, that reminds me of at camp how I kind of wanted to keep things the same way and I resented when the younger people wanted to change it. Like I get where they're coming from even as I disagree. Like, do you have other pieces like that camp can teach us, or other takeaways from how this life sort of gets distilled in a shorter time at camp?
I remember when I was 18 about to go to camp to be a junior counselor that my mother, a clinical psychologist for now over 50 years, said to me the following: the most change you will have in a short period of time is from your senior prom in the senior year of high school to Thanksgiving in your freshman year of college. It's sort of the most sort of tumultuous period of someone's life. And I couldn't help but thinking, wow, in the middle of that sandwich is me being given 12, 15-year-old boys that I'm uniquely responsible to manage. So in the middle of what is theoretically the most selfish, self-aggrandizing, self-reflective, all about me, and that 18-year-old self, I was given the responsibility for 12 other human beings. And how transformative that is for me and my understanding of myself to sort of have that experience in the middle there. So there's no doubt that experience of the 18-year-old is like a huge keystone in this arc of experience, from my being a camper to my being a division head to whatever I might go on to do, is that aspiration of being that person who's so much has been on the receiving end to being on the giving end. And there's no doubt when you compare this to other educational environments, there's a lot more porousness and intentional moving of responsibility as you're moving through that arc, where there's no doubt every single summer at every single camp, a camper will get up and make fun of the camp director, or you will not have had a full summer at camp, in ways that that same kid in a formal environment of doing the same making fun of would be kicked out of another educational environment. Camp relishes in that porousness of you challenging authority, because that means you're moving up in the ranks of authority. By my challenging it, I'm actually reaffirming it, because the camp director only knows that they're in charge because people are shaking and moving them up that ladder. And I think there's something important to designate. There's no doubt when we're thinking about camp in the context of Jewish education, camp will fall short on a lot of the overt metrics. Did they score well on the test? We're not giving tests. It's very hard to sort of line up with that. But what's interesting is when you shift out of giving grades and tests, you give up power, and all you're left with is influence. And how influential that 18-year-old, they do not have any gifts of pedagogy. They might not be so knowledgeable. All they have is influence. And how profound it is in terms of when they're leaning away from grading, away from power, into influence, what kind of impact they could have of that kid saying, I want to spend more time in this. I want to give it my attention because I want to become you. I want to be that mentor. I want to be that role model. I'm volunteering my attention to you. You're not going to marshal it from me with a grade. You're going to get me to volunteer it because I aspire to be you in the next step of this. And what does that change in terms of how I aspire to the next ring of leadership? Years ago, I wrote a piece for camp people, what are the essential components of experiential Jewish education? I'd be very quick to say, out of the 12 points, all of them could be existed in every single educational environment. None of them were unique to Jewish camp. I would say a few of them, which you will find in the show notes, are more obviously accessible in a camp.
I think behind some of this conversation, which I don't want to get to right now, but I think as I'm thinking about this is like, what is education? Maybe we can come back to that question. But
in the next 15 minutes, go.
Right. But I'm thinking, I'm trying to, in my mind, I want to go with you to what the ideal Jewish camp of the future, like Walt Disney called Walt Disney had this idea of Epcot, the experimental prototype city of tomorrow. And it was an idea, if we can sort of design the ideal city of tomorrow, then maybe those who are actually building cities or expanding cities can use that as a reference point to help them make their cities better and get to this future in a more healthy way. So I'm thinking about the experimental prototype camp of tomorrow and thinking about, what is it? Can we try to lay out a little bit? What is it that camp has as its unique educational features? Things like it's intensive, it's outdoors, it's multimodal, it's a spiral. It happens year after year, and then there's this 10-month period in between or 11-month period in between. How do we see that as an educational advantage rather than as a disadvantage? And if we kind of put all those pieces together, what might an ideal camp look like that was able to do the job that I think we might hope that camps would do? And I think that's my first question, to just try to spin that out with you a little bit. And then after that, to think about, okay, well, how do we take that ideal and say, okay, well, we have these 160 camps that are part of the Foundation for Jewish Camp. And I think there are probably a lot more camps that for one reason or another are not affiliated with the Foundation for Jewish Camp. And how can those camps that might be listening to this podcast say, yeah, actually, this conversation is giving me a sense of a way that I can move forward that doesn't actually intimidate me, that actually excites me? And I'll share with our listeners, I think, an idea that I shared with you once upon a time, which was that, I can imagine a camp that over its 8 weeks, each week is devoted to one of the Jewish holidays. And in a really intense way, the campers experience and reimagine and in a very visceral way celebrate this holiday in a way that they've never celebrated it before in their lives, with the assumption that when they then come back out of camp and are back home for the rest of the year and that holiday comes along, all of a sudden these kids have actually experienced that holiday and are able to sort of prod their parents into doing something that they may not have done before, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, the intensity of having a full summer perhaps allows us to experience the entire Jewish year, the entire Jewish life cycle in a way that's really kind of impossible in an hour or two of Hebrew school. And so I'm wondering what you think about various capacities that camp has, and how those might be used in an exciting educational way that might feed back into the year in between camp and create a spiral, or perhaps that escape velocity that we've been talking about for, what happens after camp is all over for you.
I want to go 2 directions. One is camps have to grow with intention about what their vision of utopia is, and then they can construct an educational way to maximize that. I always think about Camp Stone in Western Pennsylvania. They imagine that there are 8 epics of Jewish history, and every month of camp, kids only come for 1 month, they cover another epic of history. So one year a kid will go and they'll study the Hasmonean period. But if you spend a month on the Hasmonean period, you'll know a lot about it, more than most people do, right?
Right.
So it's an intensive, and it's over, so it's 8 epics of history, and they do 2 a summer. So in 4 years, you'll cover most of Jewish history. It's amazing, but they're not really expecting that the kids are going to be there for 8, so they add in a session and they get off cycle, but when you're a staff member, you're there for the time. You will actually have gone through Jewish history. That's another way of cutting it up. Another example, I don't think camp would end up doing this, but a camp said, hey, our kids are only here for X number of weeks a summer. We had been doing the triennial reading where we read a third of the Torah reading. What would it look like if we just said, you know what, we're going to read the Torah portion, 1 portion a week, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll pick up where we left off the next summer. So in the course of a few years, our campers will have exposure to the breadth of the 5 books of Moses. So there are many different ways of cutting the pie. All of that have to do with, after you set in motion, this is our utopian vision, and therefore, this is what education ought to look like in that space. Another idea. FJC in our time, we've run 3 incubators to start specialty camps. And those are unique opportunities for us to take unique ways of living human existence and deeply ingrained in that what Judaism looks like. Now, much of it had to do with the fact that we want to get more kids to go to camp. So if Moshe is not going to go to camp because he wants to play varsity soccer, well, we should open a sports camp so that Moshe doesn't have to decide between being on the varsity soccer team in his school and going to have a Jewish camp experience. So we've opened 4 sports camps. What's interesting and compelling from an educational perspective is not so much, here's the Jewish part of our program in 1 cup, and here's the athletic soccer program in another cup, but is the realization when you stack the cups together, as Jay Frankel has taught me, that the capacity of that 1 cup is much bigger than either of them. That when we really are modeling integration of what human experience looks like with what Jewish education looks like, they're much deeper than either of them separately.
Yes. Big ol' yes. I'm whirling around in this. I love this idea from Dan. I love all of the things that you've thrown out in terms of, if they're all built on the premise of camps seeing themselves as sort of an incubator of ideas that would then be filtering out elsewhere. So I think naming that as an important feature of camps is important, and hoping that they will own that role is important. But like the idea that a camp would do a different holiday each week of the summer, or however it would flow, I love so much. And it gets me in a few directions. One, I think part of the pushback is that in Judaism, we have such a deep sense that like the time of the year is the time of the year. Like when people ask me what Judaism is good at, I talk about the calendar and I talk about how there is this flow, even for people that aren't always like deeply in it, like marking every single holiday. But there is this sense of the flow of the year and even the flow of the week and the flow of days. And I think it's a powerful thing, which I think is part of why telling people you'd read a Torah portion that's not that week's Torah portion at summer camp. It's like chas v'shalom for a bunch of people that means like God forbid, for a bunch of people that would never believe in God or think that God forbids things. They would say, God forbid to that. But I do want to name that this has, I think, started to happen in one specific respect, which is the holiday of the 9th of Av, of Tisha B'Av. If you talk to scholars, if you talk to people that sort of look into the history of this observance especially among not Orthodox Jews or non-halachic Jews, the role of Jewish summer camp is pivotal because in the summertime, you've got Shavuot, that holiday at the beginning of the summer, although some years it's before a lot of camps start. But the 9th of Av, pretty much every summer, falls during summer camp. And over the last many decades, camps have really owned that holiday and brought their own spins to what it means. By the way, a lot of the spins, and including some of the ones I experienced, I actually don't love, but I do love that they did it. Like I love that they owned this holiday and took it on in ways that even many synagogues weren't doing. There are lots of synagogues that to this day don't really mark the 9th of Av for a variety of theological and political reasons. But I'm curious on one level to hear like your take on what's happening there, like why it is that camps have seen the 9th of Av as this unique opportunity to own a holiday that comes in the summer. But also like, what can we take from that and how could we sort of make other, I don't want to say make other 9th of Avs because it's a tragic, sad day, but like make other examples of that where in 50 years, scholars are talking about how, Jewish summer camps in the decade of the 2020s really took X on and it had an impact on all of American Jewish history in whatever way.
As a rabbi, I'm always thinking when I talk about what's the nexus between the timely and the timeless. And there's no doubt when I'm at camp, I get to do the timely and timeless and the space I'm in. So when I'm holding up moments to be authentically in my own skin, I'm sort of situating the learner and where we are in time in a cosmic way and in a very relevant way. This past summer, we got a number of calls from camp saying, Tisha B'Av's coming. We have this crisis at the border regarding detention centers. So me and my team, we turned around and we whipped together a text learning and discussion guide for this crisis because they had the time to do this, had the space to do this. How do they do something that's not just timeless, but timely? So the camps were looking for, how do we make this relevant today? So I think there's a point in there where Tisha B'Av has been alive, is offering us a seriousness, a depth. And even then, we're asking for, how do we make this timely? How do we make it relevant? When you ask the question, Lex, about other areas beyond Tisha B'Av that camps have or could go into, one of note that we have is music. Much of what we call Jewish music today is born and raised at Jewish summer camp. In terms of what it could be, I think the sky's the limit. I think there's so many different ways of being human and there's so many different ways of being Jewish. We just have to position camps to reach beyond just creating experiences for their own people, to reach beyond that to sort of unearthing and curating the ideology and ethos that are inherent to the camp and what are ways that could be expressed beyond camp.
Let's imagine for a minute that we were creating Judaism Unbound, the camp. Because, we have a take, we have an ideology, we're currently using a podcast as the means to explore it and put it out there. But what do you think we would need to be thinking about in order to make sure that this camp was doing the best job possible of accelerating a perspective in the Jewish world that we're trying to put out there and that we're trying to get to turn into something serious?
To reflect on that question, which I've never thought of, but I will think about and totally excited about, I think one of the interesting things about camp, because it is an educational space without grades, is that it's all so intimately connected to the feedback I'm getting in the moment. Is this working? I'm going to know if it's working right away, right? So I think there's something intriguing about podcast because it's more engaging than the book, but it's notably less engaging than the person standing in front of you having a conversation. So the opportunity of saying, is this working for you? Is this not working for you? Are we being innovative or are we being stodgy and traditionalist? Or how are we balancing those things? Would change dramatically if it was left in the dynamic space where I'm getting instantaneous feedback. I have a clear vision, I think, from listening to your podcast, what the long-term vision is. It's a curious process to think about how to remediate that to the 9-year-old getting off the bus.
I'll tell you what it is as I think about it. For example, what I would be trying to achieve, and by the way, one of our earlier conversations was with Rebecca Milder, who's the founder of an after-school program called the Jewish Enrichment Center that I've actually sent my daughter to precisely because, or at least in part because, I think it achieves what I'm trying to achieve, which is that it empowers a child to see the task of a Jew, whether that's a Jewish child or a Jewish adult, is a creative task. It's right. It's not that the right way to be a Jew is to act in X, Y, and Z way that has always been the way that Jews act, but rather to say that the way that this stream wants me to be a Jew is to say that a Jew is someone who takes all of this raw material and crunches it up and does interesting things with it. And so, I can imagine a camp that had that impact. I think it might be Camp Tawonga, right? We might not have to create that camp, but it feels that that's kind of the goal that I have in mind.
Yeah, I look forward to Camp Unbound, On Camp Unbound, but we'll have to workshop names too. I have one last question about sort of what camps do Jewishly, and first off, by the way, a lot of what I think I've learned from Jewish camp actually happened long after I was there. Like, I actually think I wasn't processing things as a 12-year-old or 14-year-old, but as a 25-year-old, as a 28-year-old now, it planted the seed for me to realize certain things that affect how I see the world. I think that's a piece of camp that we don't always talk about, is what it does even a decade or two afterwards. But when I look back on Jewish summer camp, I think that there's something powerful created in simply a space where normatively Jewish is the thing. For the vast majority of people going to Jewish summer camp, really, if they're from anywhere other than Israel or certain areas that are majority Jewish in the United States, the rare outliers, camp is the one space in their year where it is the norm, where Judaism, where Jewish culture, whatever sets of words we're going to use, is not something that makes you distinct from the rest of your society. It's actually something that you share with your mini society. I guess if you go to Jewish day school, if you go to certain spaces, although we've talked to people, more and more Jewish day schools are not actually only Jewish spaces. And Jewish summer camps also have folks who aren't Jewish there. But I guess I'd love to think about what made certain things Jewish at summer camp. What was Jewish about archery? The counselors probably weren't being particularly thoughtful about drawing from Jewish texts about archery. I mean, there are things you could do there, by the way. There's interesting parallels, but part of what was Jewish was simply that we were doing it at Jewish summer camp. And sometimes I feel like there's a pushback from folks who have whose inclination is that the magic of camp really is just being around other Jews. When you try to infuse all of this intention about, specific values, specific, et cetera, it makes the Judaism specific to when you're doing Jewish education and not just sort of the context of the whole experience. So I guess, what does it do for people to spend a concerted amount of time and effort being in a context that is normatively Jewish? And what do you think that does to the people who experience it once they come back to the rest of their lives?
There are two questions you're putting forward. I think one question which we've been asking about overnight camp, and I think is actually even more interesting to ask about day camp, is what does it mean to be in a environment which is that Judaism is the dominant culture? And what does that mean? And I think increasingly, what does that mean when it could be a haven of it being the dominant culture when there are non-Jews present? And what does that mean to be in power and the dominant culture? And how do we treat the other in that space? So I don't want to overlook day camp, and I don't want to overlook the nature of what it means to be creating these islands of Judaism being the dominant culture. And also recognizing, intentionally or not, those different environments are putting forward what is normative and authentic. And recognizing that there's a certain hegemony of who gets to call authentic Judaism. And these different camps are actually brazenly saying, this is our authentic Jewish, and it need not conform to yours. And that's great and very healthy. And to a degree to which that's not communicated, that might be okay. To a degree to which it's not intentional, I think we have some work to do. Because the reality is there are plenty of experiences that I don't want to forecast that you're having. It might ruin it. Lex, you articulated it might have been 10 years after the fact that you figured out what it was about. The reality is what experiential education can do, because it is not having to be transparent, it's allowing us to obfuscate some of the lessons. It's like a large Mr. Miyagi project. It's all about this deferred revelation that could create experiences that you will be able to unpack later on. We need to do it with intention. We don't necessarily need to be explicit about it. I need to be explicit with my staff so they can create that magic. I'm not sure it always helps me to tell the student or tell the learner what's going on at that moment. I always think about the chemistry class where the kid raises his hand and says, is this going to be on the final? And the answer is, I have to tell you yes or no, because I, the teacher, am judging you on your capacity to perform. Right? The minute the kid says, what is the night activity tonight? And the counselor says, I can't tell you, but it's going to be extraordinary. The night activity has begun. You have to live up to that expectation, but it's already begun. And if I told you, I might have ruined it. I will be judged ultimately on my intention, but there's a theater of obfuscation, which is actually part of the joy of it and how it's playful and fun and engaging. If we can get students to get out of their own way, they will become the great karate masters, as opposed to just waxing my car.
As we close, is there anything that we haven't been able to touch on yet that you just want to leave our listeners with to help them frame or reframe or vision or revision what Jewish summer camp has the potential to do moving forward?
I believe that Jewish camp has proven its utility for the North American Jewish experience. I think for us to get all of the goodness, all of the play, all of the engagement, all of the depth, all of the community outside of that bubble, we as a Jewish community need to invite and demand that our camp sit at the educational table with the rest of the Jewish educational institutions. We need to invite them to say, you're part of us, you can't disappear into the forest. But we need to demand that you're part of us and that we are all working in the same direction of creating deep experiences that will enable and empower the youth of today to be the adults of tomorrow. When I was 18 years old, I figured out who I was as a camper. And when I was in my 20s and came back to camp to be a division head, I figured out who I was as a counselor. This deferred revelation is about that arc of experience. It's also about reflecting who I was, the earlier step, and who I want to be in the next step. Camp exists along that continuum because it enables us to move along it and reflect backwards. And that process is a profound educational platform of self-actualization and aspiration.
I really want to thank you and cherish the words that you brought today. Thanks so much for joining us, Avi.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close this out in the same way that we always do by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we'd like to make is that we really deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way. And you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. So thanks so much for listening to this episode. We've got many, many more on Jewish education coming your way. We hope you'll join us for them. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.